So that when I send out the follow-up email, you guys, I'll send a recording and and then I'll also send the slide that Rochelle is going to use so that you have that information. And then please, 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 you guys, ask questions. These sessions are really for you to learn as much as you can. And Rochelle is an absolute expert in this field of board service. So please ask questions, and hopefully we'll leave some time at the end for questions as well. You can put them in chat during the presentation, or you can come off mic and ask a question. It doesn't matter. So just a couple minutes about ESA. For the past 7 years, we've partnered with ADP to build this executive community of nearly 3,000 participants in 20 cities, delivering world-class thought leadership and exposure to innovative technologies that are shaping the future of work. And we're unique. Jeff Wald and I kind of go round and round because he thinks I should be just CHROs, and I say no. We're unique in that we bring CHROs, CIOs, and other work tech executives together because we really believe that they all must be in lockstep to be able to deliver the kind of worker experience that's necessary to attract and retain talent, especially now. So today, we want to share details of our board positioning membership that provides many of the resources an executive needs to navigate to their perfect board seat. And we launched this program last year, and since then we've added resources and changed our pricing structure based on feedback we received from last year's participants. And by the way, at least 6 of our members last year have landed board positions after being in this program. So the board positioning membership provides resources in 2 areas. First, those that are covered in the cost, and that includes monthly sessions moderated by Carrie Miller of Overton VC. And she highlights startups that are part of their portfolio and really talks about how you can convert your executive leadership abilities into the startup world. And she's also brought several other VCs into the process as well. We've added a group, Targeted Velocity, and they advise startups on how to use and staff an advisory board. And if they've created an ESA Innovation Product Lab session or sessions, giving our members exposure to startups which are actually looking for advisors for their boards. And in addition, we have monthly sessions with experienced board members sharing their board journey on both being selected, the right fit for a board, and what you should consider when you're looking at serving on a board. And finally, we have monthly sessions led by consulting firms on recent board topics, including financial statements, M&A, digital transformation, cybersecurity, and how to quantify human capital. So we also offer access to additional resources if you want to go deeper into your board journey. And those include first-year special pricing in a membership in the Private Directors Association, special pricing on branding packages offered by Coruscant Technologies, and I saw Brian's on today. And then finally, special pricing on coaching, board resume preparation, and a detailed board navigation plan offered by Michelle Campbell. In fact, I'm admitting her in again. I hope she can stay with us. So I'm going to introduce Rochelle, and hopefully she can take over. She is an accomplished board advisor and recruiter, D&I thought leader, columnist, and speaker. She focuses on governance, policy, diversity coaching, and board succession planning. She's had a successful career supporting boards and executives across industries and sizes. She spent almost a decade with the National Association of Corporate Directors, NACD, where she led the NACD advisory and board recruitment practice. And then she currently sits on the board of the Private Directors Association. So with that, Rochelle, are you there? And
I am here. Okay. Can you make me host again so I can share my screen?
Yes. Where are there you go.
Perfect. Sorry about the little hiccup I had. Of course, the classic computer crash.
That's okay. As long as you're here, because we need you. You're the star.
All right, well, let's get started. Can you see just the main slide?
Yes.
Perfect.
We're seeing your presentation interface. So we're seeing 2 slides.
Oh, 2 slides. That's what I thought. Okay, let me get out of here for a minute and let me just do this. There we go.
That's better. Thank you.
All right. So thank you for the introduction, Cindy. I really appreciate it. And it's great to see everyone here today. While Cindy gave a lot of information, let me just jump in with a little bit of what I'm doing right now. So I am founder and CEO and managing member of Leadership Elevated, which is an organization working to place candidates on boards, working with boards very closely on evaluations, education, governance, coaching, etc. We approach it 2 ways. One, either from the board level with corporations or individuals looking to get resume support, individual coaching, etc. So part of the summation of what Cindy said is that I bring about 15 years experience working with boards directly in placing candidates into this conversation around how to consider moving towards your first board seat or your next board seat. So let me just jump in. The first thing is I want to mention before we even get started on sort of my top 8 ways to prepare yourself. It's really a difficult market. There is somewhere in the neighborhood of, and it kind of depends on the year, somewhere in the neighborhood of it changes, but it's about 4,000 public companies if you're looking at all of the exchanges. Those 4,000 public companies, and I'm talking OTC and MX as well, they replace about 1 director a year. It's like 1.2-ish on average, depending on the company size, and that sort of takes into account larger boards as well. About 85% of board roles go through personal and professional networking, with some variation thereof with either boards that have requested their HR executives to pass on some vetting resumes to recruiters, outside recruiters. But generally speaking, most of it happens through networking. So a lot of what we're going to focus on is how you can get there. So one is to also be prepared for the recruiters when they come, prepared for the HR directors and the board chairs when they come, but really focusing on that networking piece. Separately, I will just note, because Cindy mentioned the Private Directors Association, there are likely somewhere in the neighborhood of 10,000 boards at any given time that are privately owned, that are either PE, VC, ESOP, co-op, startup, family-owned boards that are looking for board members as they either sort of launch or really grow into different sizes. And so a lot of what we'll talk about too is aligning your skill sets to those kinds of boards, and it's a really good way to focus your board experience. Another thing is that I'll just mention top line is it takes a board role to get a board role. We'll talk a little more about that, but boards require that kind of experience. So nonprofit boards are really one of the best ways that you can start that conversation. And I know there's lots of mixed reviews from other people around nonprofit boards, but I can tell you from my personal experience, I have placed a number of candidates on for-profit boards as their first for-profit board because I was able to demonstrate they had skills and expertise from the nonprofit space. So just a couple of notes to get started. As Cindy mentioned also, I want this to be really interactive. I want you guys to be able to ask questions that you have as we go through this. We'll just review each one of these things in detail as listed here. But if anything pops up, please jump in with additional questions, and I'll make sure I also save some time at the end for anything that we don't get covered between now and then. So let me jump in. Develop your board resume, bio, and LinkedIn profile. This is one of the most important things you can do. There's a number of reasons. One is really about getting organized around yourself and your skill sets and that you are qualified. Some of that is about understanding where you align. So we'll talk a little more about your value proposition. But a lot of it is really just being able to be found, whether that's through the networking process. So if you're at a networking event and you pass your card on and somebody goes and finds your name, they'll go right to LinkedIn. It just is always how it works. Some of it's about being found by when a board looks at their HR team and says, hey, we need some board members. Who do you know? You might be found that way. When the networking thing I mentioned, also just as a side note, if you don't know yet, make sure you figure out how to use the QR code on your LinkedIn profile. We can talk about that later if you have questions, but it's a really easy thing. You can also just Google it, but it's a great way to be networking with folks while you're out at different events. The other piece is that it helps to really helps you focus on understanding, again, your value proposition, but it helps you also get clear on your value to others. The resume is really critical, I think, really starting at the resume process. Sorry, let me turn things off since I had to turn everything back on to get to the meeting. It helps you focus on getting clear on the industries, on revenue, those kinds of things. And when you start with your resume and you start building it out on paper and you have some time to iterate with that document, it really helps you be clear that you are ready for board work. I always say sort of get it clear here so you can get it clear here. So resumes first. Every recruiter, I'll just tell you, uses a different document. Some want longer resumes, some want shorter resumes. Most are moving towards the 3 to 4 page resume. You always want to have a speaker bio, some very traditional recruiters. So some of the big 4, older, big 7, I'll call it, older recruiters often use bios, longer board bios, we call them. A board bio is basically a speaker's bio that has board work at the top of it. And then your LinkedIn profile is honestly one of the most important things. But I think that if you start that into that process with your resume, you can really just cut and paste it onto your LinkedIn profile. So make sure that you're considering that information. Make sure that you're updating your language, even if you had it done 2 or 3 or 4 years ago. Go through and look at it and figure out how things have changed. So, one example might be that 10 or 15 years ago, 15 years ago, companies were looking for audit. They wanted audit skills. Well, then audit kind of changed to, audit and risk. And then it changed to enterprise risk management. And then it changed to ERM. And then it, and who knows what it'll be next. So, make sure that you're modifying the language in your resume as the times change. I was just talking to somebody earlier about, they were a CISO. And, they had some really technical, very old language in their profiles because they became a CISO when CISOs were just starting out, 15, 20 years ago. And a lot of that is not relevant now to what companies are doing. And it doesn't help solidify yourself as a leader in the industry. It was more sort of junior oriented. So going through your resume every couple of years and making those changes are really important as well. Make sure that I mentioned board work, nonprofit board work should always be at the top of your resume. It is one of the most important things that you can include in relation to board work altogether. And then your LinkedIn profile, part of what you want to do is share, but we'll talk a little more of that around the social media presence. Let me pause and see if there are any direct questions on resumes before we move on. Okay, great.
Actually,
Yeah.
let me just ask a question. You just mentioned highlighting your board work first on the resume is really critical.
Mm-hmm.
Is that true of nonprofit board work?
Yeah, this is always like it's marketing, really. So you look at your marketing game, you figure out what it is you have to market, and you market the most important stuff first. So if you only have nonprofit board work, then yes, it's critical. The way that humans approach any information, generally speaking, is that we read it and believe it until we're proven otherwise. So if you have a headline at the top of your LinkedIn, at the top of your resume, at the top of your bio that says board member, CHRO or financial executive or financial services executive, then I believe immediately that you are a board member. And then if you double down on that by in your paragraph, you explain that you're a board member or say something about it. And then if you triple down and show me the board work, then I understand that you're ready and prepared to have that dialogue with me. And the reality is, there are, hundreds of thousands of executives theoretically that could be looking for these board seats right now. And not everyone's prepared and not everyone understands it and not everyone is ready for it. And the more likely you are to have that information on your profile, the more likely I am to pause and have a conversation with you. And especially just in terms of me sorting on LinkedIn, even people that I know and have worked with over the years, there's some people that I've tried to sort of move forward to this level of experience and to the oversight conversation that happens with board language, and they just can't get there. And if I've got, we're all trying to do a job, we're all trying to do the best job we can in the quickest time we can. And so as we're headed down that journey, if I find people that are prepared, ready, that it's there, that it's demonstrated, I will be more likely to talk to them than those who don't have it. The other thing I would just add to that is that if you're working with a recruiter, or if a recruiter is finding you, they're typically being sourced through a junior recruiter or a research assistant that doesn't have enough knowledge or know-how to understand your industry deeply, to understand the work that you've done. So you sort of make it easy for them by putting board member first. And I will just say one additional comment around that is that if you have a significant amount of for-profit board experience, even if it's private or small company for-profit or startup, then you might move your nonprofit experience to the bottom, just so that we're focusing on the highlighting of information around board work and then focusing on the highlighting of the most relevant executive skills. Any other questions?
Yes, Rochelle, this is Valerie Norton High, Chief
Hi.
People Officer for Habitat for Humanity International.
Oh.
Thank you for sharing all this with us. I'm excited to hear the rest of your presentation. Just a quick question on resumes. You mentioned a longer resume becoming more popular. Does that mean you would include your entire career, or do you tend to stay in the last 20 years or so? What would you recommend?
You want people, so, that's a sticky subject. Let me just say that for those that don't know, board members are not employees. There's no EEOC guidelines. So if a board member wants somebody who's 80 years old and has deep experience, great. And if they want somebody who is 22 and lives in California and is, part of an LGBTQA group, that's great as well. I'll go find both. But then there's this sort of fine line between trying to sort of explain that you're accomplished enough to be able to be a board member for the most part. So I say, include all if you can, if it's relevant, if it makes sense. In terms of detail, 20 years, at least 15 years of detail, at least 5 years of some detail, and then you can kind of line item, some people do things like customer service multiple roles for these 7 years, or, for kind of depending on how old they are and where they are in their career. Some people will do things like, military. I see a lot more of that same thing too, sort of multiple roles across X period of time. Or if you were in a company for a long time, you might have held progressively, more roles, but really you need at least 20 years of detail. Any other questions?
Rochelle, could you talk a little bit more about the QR code?
Yes. Let me see if I can do this with you guys. This will be fun. This is my fun. I love this little learning thing. So if you're networking somewhere and boards need to know that you understand what's happening in the environment, whether you're a technologist or a CHRO or another role altogether. And that some of that is this sort of trending information. So LinkedIn has made it really hard, because if you're not connected with somebody, it can be hard to find them. Sometimes there might be 17 Rick buyers. As a matter of fact, Rick, we were speaking yesterday and it took me a minute to find you again because I didn't have you already attached to my LinkedIn. So when you're networking, I'm going to just show you let's see if I can do this. Oh, you know what? Here, we'll do something different. Oh, I can't do it different. I don't think I can do it with my computer screen. So if you all were to open your LinkedIn at the very top of your phone, and I think this is only on phones, I should double check, but I've never tried it with a computer before, but you're going to see your little profile. If you hit the home button on the bottom left, at the very top in the left side, you'll see your picture. And then you'll see the search bar, and then you'll see a little sort of thought bubble or comment bubble. Click the search bar. And when you click that search bar, on the right side, you see what looks like 4 little squares or 3 little squares inside of a big square. Click that square. And when you click that square, let's see if this will work. My name pops up with a QR code that somebody else can scan and can directly connect with me. If you, on the left side, it says my code, because that's mine and I want you to scan me. On the right side, it says scan, and it shows you, it then opens up your camera essentially and allows you to scan somebody else's code. You don't even have to use that scan function. Your own camera in your phone will allow you to scan it, and then you can quickly connect. The next comment I'll make on that is that it will take you to the person's profile. You have to take the action to connect. People will sometimes scan and say, great, we're connected. Well, you have to actually follow through on the process. Another thing I'll mention is that always connect, don't follow. It only follow if you don't have an option to connect, if you don't have their, if they've got a firewall with an email address or something, but always connect first. Connecting gives you the opportunity to communicate, to send messages if you don't have a higher level of service with LinkedIn. And that might be the make or break between you getting a board role. If you've applied for a board role through an organization like PDA or even LinkedIn, if you have direct connection to somebody on that board, you can message them later and say, hey, you know, so-and-so, I've just sent in my application for the board role, would love to connect with you and learn more about, you know, what you're thinking about with the process, or, you know, would love to understand the dynamics a little more, or, you know, connect if you have any questions, whatever the thing might be. So if you don't connect first, then you can't do that. So just always make sure you connect and not follow.
Thank you.
All right, so assess your skill sets and understand your value. And this is really designed to help you be more successful, but I'm going to give you kind of a tough example. A woman called me one day and said, I am so excited. I just sold my $5 million business making, I think it was ice cream or something. And I want to know how to get on a Fortune 500 board. And I just said, you cannot. There is no possibility. There's no Fortune 500 board that's looking for a candidate who sold a $5 million ice cream company. Maybe if it was, you know, the coolest widget in the world and a tech company really needed it, that's possible. But the reality is the value proposition has to be there for a company to want to have you. So typically companies, if they're looking to recruit, they're looking to recruit up. So meaning if they're a $100 million company or a $1 billion company, they want somebody who's 200 million or 1.5 billion, because they want to grow and they want your expertise to get into that space. You're supposed to be able to guide the executive team through a questioning and oversight process. That is your role as a board member. So your value has to align with that kind of organization. Another way to think about that, though, is that you have some flexibility if you weren't in the C-suite, if you weren't a CHRO, if you were a VP or EVP or some version of that, if you were 2 or 3 steps below the CEO of a major corporation, then it's easier for you to go down into a smaller organization. So again, back to your $1 billion example, if you were an EVP or a VP in a $1 billion business, it would not be difficult for you to become a board member for a $100 million business. If you were a C-suite for $1 billion business, it's more likely that you'll be a C-suite for another $1 billion business or slightly lower. So that's sort of how we think about skill sets. And again, it's organized around growth. The other thing I would just say is when you're thinking about skill sets, it's also industry relevant, and there's a lot of value for CHROs and I say technologists to encompass CISOs and CTOs and CIOs and the 100 acronyms around it. And that would be the same for like chief people and chief talent and all the acronyms around that. It's actually tends to be a little easier for people in your organizations in those roles to move industries. So you might find a technology industry, perhaps you were in supply chain, a technology industry wants to start actually developing their widgets and selling them. You would be a great person for them to help understand the talent pool and development across industries. So don't get so focused on the industry that you've been in, and think more broadly about how as the economy changes, as technology changes, as industry changes, that those skills are really transferable, and do some reading on how you might be able to communicate that value to somebody who doesn't see it or doesn't understand it. So you might learn a little more about how technology, you know, how chip manufacturing happens, or you might learn a little bit more as for your CHRO in great example is a CHRO in either oil and gas or in grain producing or heavy industry. Might go to like a waste company where the talent is still very blue collar talent, and they need to have some development around it. And there are sort of things around that you can make sure that your skills are transferable and have those talking points ready. And then the other thing is just really understanding the oversight values. So a board's role is really around oversight. It's not managing. And some of what happens in that value proposition that people sort of try to understand and know that they have and can share, some of what happens in that is that they use too much of the doing, too much of the managing, and not enough of the oversight, thoughtful questioning, guidance, which is what happens at the board level. So really understand what you've done in your career and make some of those language transitions again in yourself so that it comes easily to your conversations that you're having in networking events. The next thing is to develop and execute a strategic plan and get a coach. So that can look a number of different ways, but the reality is, you know, if you're still in industry, that might look like, okay, first I'm going to go to my CEO and make sure that I have the ability to serve on an outside board, either nonprofit or for-profit, and just get that clarifying piece of information. The other side to that might be that if you're transitioning into a new role, into a new executive role, that you negotiate that. Even if you don't have a board role, it actually can help increase your compensation. So if somebody feels like you are so important and available that, that because you have board roles or because you need to be available in case board roles come up as well, they tend to find you more valuable, and it can be sometimes a tool to actually increase compensation. So make sure that you're using sort of this jumping process if you're still in executive roles, and if you're not, if you're still sitting in and you're not planning on changing roles, make sure that your executives are on board. It might also mean that you make sure your board members of your current corporation are on board. And part of that is because you want them to be your advocate. You want them to be your mentor. You want them to be your sponsor for other board roles. And I've talked to a number of executives over the years whose boards have loved them. 1 or 2 or 3 people have said that they're really going to make it their focus to get that executive a board role. And then they go out and talk to all of the boards that they're on. Most public company and large private company board members are on multiple types of boards across multiple industries, generally speaking. And so let them be your advocate as they know other people in the industry looking for board members. Part of that strategic plan is also, it's also about ensuring you meet enough people. So it takes a long time to get a board seat. It takes 2 to 4 years on average for a paid board role, depending on how active you are, you know, where you're coming from, where you're headed to, what the economy looks like. Part of that process is that you have to meet enough people. You have to have shared your value enough times. They have to know or somehow be affiliated with a board, that that's looking to place a director. That board has to go, oh, you know, I think we need this CHRO from X industry. And somebody might say, oh, I know Gay, I see your name, so I'm going to just pick on you. I know Gay, she's great at this kind of thing. And then they have to decide that they're ready to start the process. That person, if somebody's retiring, that person has to retire. When that person retires and they're ready to backfill for a skill set, maybe not the same, but a skill set, and you fit that skill set, they might kick off a search. Usually it's a sort of rule of 3. They talk about kicking off a search. They decide how they're going to think about it. They might bring in, a call for an RFP, essentially. They will then have a decision process, then they'll actually kick off the search, and then they have to go through the search process. So you're kind of somewhere between 18 months and 2 years for just that process alone. So if you think about it, takes 2 years to meet the right people, then another 2 years for those boards to go through that process. Sometimes it's a very extensive process. So developing that plan and getting sort of condensing the front side of it is really one of the most critical things. And one of the sort of rules of thumb that you might use here is that your strategic plan should include that you meet at least 3 new people a week, 2 to 3 new people a week that you can share your value with, that you can share, that you're available for board roles, that you're ready for board roles, that you're thinking about board roles. And this becomes a fine dance that you'll use kind of throughout the rest of these bullets here. The dance is that we all have likely dated or liked somebody or hired somebody. And in that process, anyone that's too desperate, we're always weary of. It's a little bit of a mystery. You want to find the best person. So the best person isn't going to necessarily be available. So that there's this dance that happens where the language that you share is some version of, oh, I went to Cindy's program and learned about board work because I'm really headed in that direction right now. Oh, I'm interested in board roles that might be right for my skill set or that I would find that I could add value or service to. Oh, are you, thinking about, if you know of any boards, I would love to see if my skill set aligns to it. So it's this like dance between not being desperate, but being excited about serving in a new way or in a new capacity or on a new opportunity. And I'm telling you, that dance is really important, both at the, at the networking stage, at the interview stage, on your resumes. And to that end, never put open for board roles or objective board roles on your resume or your LinkedIn or your bio. It is surefire the first way not to get an interview. So, and then the last thing on there is getting a coach. So just thinking about, how can you ensure that you're ready and prepared and that your language is ready and that you're holding yourself accountable If you get into the interview process, how can you make sure you're prepared for the interview? And getting a coach is really one of the great ways to do that. So whether it's with a networking group, whether it's an individual, sometimes corporations will pay for it, but just work towards that and make sure they're board ready, board prepared individuals. There have been, in the last number of years, dozens and dozens and dozens of organizations that are popping up in this space. So just make sure that they're board ready folks. And that they have the data to prove that somehow. All right, next thing on there is, ooh,
Hey,
sorry.
Rochelle,
Yes,
there's one question that you might want to answer. Given
Sure.
today's emphasis on reporting and disclosures, how important is this for a board candidate?
I would need more information on the
Okay.
question. Can whoever said that speak up?
So on,
Yeah, I'm fessing up to it. So the SEC released their environmental disclosure
Yesterday.
requirements back last year in the summertime. That actually threw a wrench in the whole reporting area. But we're anticipating that they're going to now release disclosure requirements for human capital. That's going to happen before the end of the year. The EFRAG under the IFRS in Europe has 6 standards that require disclosures for any company trading on the European exchange. There's all this controversy about ESG reporting. How important is it for a board candidate to really understand all the disclosure requirements from all the governance monitoring agencies, including the UN SDG and the World Economic Forum? And, does it help get you a position on a board if you're an expert in that area?
I'm going to answer that in 2 ways. One is that no board, I don't care the size of the board, no board has space for a one-trick pony. So if your only trick is disclosures, because you're a lawyer, no. If your only trick is hiring and firing because you had a very narrow scope in your CHR role, no. If your only trick is, security because you were a CISO, no. And each one of those roles will have some form of compliance and reporting and processes. A board has an executive team in place to do those things. Your job as an executive or as a board member would be to say, are you doing them? Show me the proof, not do them yourself. And the reality is they wouldn't hire you for something that you don't have the skill set in. So, I have people that let's go back to my CISO or CHR example. They're not auditors. You may have to go on the audit committee so you can learn the business, but you're not expected to understand the math necessarily. So from the recruiting perspective, whomever you are, said person would be brought on for the skills that you currently have. And your job is to ask good questions of the issues of the day, which will always change. From a compliance perspective, from sort of flipping that around, what are companies looking for now as regulation is changing? They're looking for people that are more dynamic. So again, back to the same way, they don't want a one-trick pony. So they want somebody who, from an ESG perspective, that wasn't even on their radar really for a number of years in different ways. It's now on their radar. So if you happen to be a CHRO or pick your role, happen to have X role, but you also have ESG experience, make sure that information is on your resume. And that goes back to the buzzwords I was talking about earlier when I said enterprise risk management. Find your role, find the thing, and make sure the language is there. Don't use it if it's not. So I know I've seen people say things like ESG and DE&I, and they have literally no experience in either of those fields. They just happen to be in a company that, somewhere tangentially it's come up. Running one focus group is not the same thing as having a deep DE&I experience. So make sure you're really clear about those things and don't use the acronyms unless you have them. But yes, adding all of those things are relevant. And to that end, boards will be looking as regulation changes. It will take about 2 years generally from that. When the SEC does something new or funky or interesting, it takes it. And when it's serious, it takes about 2 years, usually there's like a 6 months to 18 months on ramp to the thing they're changing. And then even the on ramp allows for a lot of soft language, and it takes a few years for some of that to change. So for the technologists that might be on the call, there is a very serious rule that will affect every company that's public around cybersecurity and cybersecurity disclosures. That will, I think, come out in the next couple of months. That will change the way that companies are looking at these things. Right now companies have people who are like CFOs who had a technologist report to them. That will still stand. I think this is my prediction. I should just say that will still stand because the SEC is not in the business of destroying boards across the country and shaking things up too far. I think it will strengthen a little bit, and there'll be some 2-year requirement to get somebody with more technical expertise. But I still think that people who are like chief risk officers who worked very closely with technology will still align. So it's kind of always a fuzzy gray area based off of the industry, the company, and the way the regulation's written. Does that make sense? Okay. Any more questions before I move on? Okay. The next thing on there is network. So the strategic plan is for you to figure out how to meet people. The next part is to actually start executing that plan. And that means network everywhere. Back to meeting new people. I know, if I've sat in rooms with, I just can't even begin to tell you the crazy stories that I've heard around how somebody found a board role. I know somebody that got it in a grocery aisle at a grocery store because they got talking about some newspaper that was up on the stand and it led to a board role. I know somebody that got it at a lacrosse game. I know somebody that told some, it's usually secondary and tertiary relationships. I've heard of sort of four-tier relationships where you knew somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody who said yes. So it really is about networking wide. Groups like this, PDA, anything else that you can think of, chambers of commerce can sometimes be helpful, especially in communities when you're looking for smaller roles or nonprofit roles. Cindy mentioned the 2 pieces on startups and VCs and those kinds of things. Those are all great places to start. You might start there. They might know somebody else that might know somebody else that will get you into a board role. So get serious about it and network. And while you're out networking, one of my little, whether you like it or not, favorite phrases is God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth, and you should use them in that proportion. Make sure you're asking good questions and listening to people. And if you can spend the time that you have to ask good questions of the people in whom you're networking, thoughtful, interesting questions, they will know that you are interested and they will think you are interesting. And so part of that time that you spend together, that interesting time together, is by, again, 2/3 asking questions, 1/3 telling an interesting story about yourself that they can remember you. When I see a resume that says I did things and did stuff and managed some people, I don't remember that. It's gone as quickly as it came in. When I see a resume that says, I doubled revenue in 6 months and grew the staff by 10 and brought a new widget to market, that's something that's memorable. Those are tangible pieces of information that my brain can hold on to and then file away later. These sort of loose descriptive adjectives are not tangible in the way that we organize memory. So telling that story that's interesting, and you use that story as a tipping off point, like, oh, that's so interesting. The comment the speaker made, I did the same thing or tried to do the same thing and it worked or didn't work, or just some version of that. And then saying, what was your experience like that? And then listening and then asking follow-up questions. For some reason, they have figured out in social psychology that you asking questions makes you memorable to the person who's sharing the information. So just when you're networking, think about it from that perspective. Next thing on there is to develop your social media presence. So I've mentioned LinkedIn. We just talked about the QR code, but it's really important that you've got a strong LinkedIn, that it's totally filled out, that you've got, your volunteer experience, and make sure your board work is on your LinkedIn at the top in chronological order-ish as relevant. You can move things around. You can take LinkedIn, classes on that. There's also a guy named Michael Quinn who has a free downloadable document on his LinkedIn profile, actually, that teaches you a little more about LinkedIn. I love Michael. He's a super nice guy. He and I do a lot of work with military. So it's, I think, oriented towards military, but the functionality of LinkedIn is the same. So just get really active there. The other thing is building a network on LinkedIn. So connect with people. Make sure that you're sharing things on LinkedIn. It can be a full-time job sometimes to be really active on LinkedIn. So one quick way to be active in a quick version would be to share somebody's stories. You can hashtag to figure out what your interest is, find things on board work or governance, or find things in your industry read them quickly, and then just say, this is interesting from a board perspective. I wonder what you think, and then repost it. And then you have started a dialogue and people start positioning you in their mind as somebody who's active in the governance space. You can also develop a website that can be helpful depending on who you are. You can add social media or other interviews, podcasts, anything that you have writing, anything that you've done that people can see that you're an active board member, or that you can be active and thoughtful in this space, or that you can go on a road show for an IR, investor relations, roadshow can be really helpful. So really just figuring out what that social media presence looks like and then harnessing it. Separately or alternatively, whatever you say, just know this is the age of social media. So whatever you say lasts forever. And whether you're conservative or liberal, and as you make those comments on people's posts or repost things that are conservative or liberal, you will be pigeonholed in those spaces, and that is fine and good. Just know that that's what it is. So if you make a really conservative post or comment, you're likely not going to get placed on a Planned Parenthood board or anything to that effect. If you are promoting Planned Parenthood stuff, I'm just using this as an example for Touchstone in the greater world, you're probably not going to get on a conservative for-profit board like Lutheran, charities or something to that effect. So just know that that matters and that it will affect your career the same way anything else would, and just be aware that it will also affect your board space as well. Next thing on there is educating yourself on board fundamentals and staying current. So that was a great comment by Sloan. That's exactly what's going on. The world is changing all of the time. The Securities and Exchange Commission, who drives all the regulation around public company boards, is changing all the time. NACD, the National Association of Corporate Directors, did a great report where it's about 80% of private companies now have an audit committee. I think that they're going to end up with cyber committees. I think they may end up with certainly environmental committees to some degree, or it'll be folded in somehow. So it really, that rolls down, that sort of trickle down effect tends to happen in different ways and in different places with private companies, but those things will matter. So be prepared to stay ahead of what's happening. You can do that by, just things like you can set up Google alerts, although I know that brings a lot of garbage sometimes. I have a subscription to the Wall Street Journal. I read it every day. They are the best, I think, in particularly around board level information and reporting and interviews and comments. So I just love the Wall Street Journal. Anything to that effect is, that you can follow, whether it's your national paper, your local paper, et cetera, industry magazines, those kinds of things. And then in terms of really getting educated, we're not even talking about fiduciary duties in this conversation. That's a whole other conversation. And that can be something that you read a book on. It can be something that you take a 3-day class on, or a week-long class on, or study at your own pace. If you join PDA, you get a complimentary access to a complimentary certification on board work. So that is one option for you in terms of thinking about education. NACD has a program and certification. Harvard has a week-long. Most major universities have week-long programs. So just sort of figure out what that looks like for you, and make sure that you're starting that process around education, because understanding your fiduciary duties will help you better be a better board member, be able to execute on the questioning and answering, and understand your role in terms of supporting the organization through strategy and through ethics and through things like ESG, cybersecurity, and audit. So really understanding the board's role in compensation and retention and recruitment, those things are all really relevant to a board, and you can get that through that foundational education. Number 7 on there is to get to know recruiters. So I'm a boutique recruiter. Connect with me on LinkedIn, send me your resumes. I have them in my database, but I am one of 10,000 across the country, and I'm just guessing on that number. It's got to be more than that, honestly. Most boutique recruiters work at the board level if given the opportunity. They don't always seek it out. Every major recruiter, so I've sat on panels with the top 7 recruiters in the country that all have board offices. If you have connections or resources from anywhere and throughout your career into those top 7, and you can just Google who are the top 7 recruiters in the country, you can send them your board resume, because they all have board offices, and they're throughout different locations in the country. Heidrick is in Chicago, Egon is New York, Diversified's here in DC. So sort of figure out where you are. I think Russell Reynolds is Texas. So just figure out where you are or who you know, and regardless, send that office your resume or get an introduction, better yet, into those offices. And just make sure that you're checking back in. So we get busy again. We're all trying to do the same thing. We're all trying to get our pants on one leg at a time and get out the door and take care of grandma or the dog or whoever. And we forget. So the more that you can connect back and not ask anything, this is the same thing for networking. The more that you can check back in and not ask for things, but just share information and be of value to somebody, the more likely you are for them to remember you. So there's this guy, his name's Mark. Mark lives in Philadelphia. I will never forget Mark. Mark sent me, I met him one time. He came into the office. He connected with me for a few minutes when I was at NACD. Mark has, without fail, sent me an email or a handwritten note every 6 months for the last 10 years. By the time it was a year or 2 or 3 into that conference, into Mark just keeping up with me, just saying, hey, I got a new board role, or hey, I'm doing this great nonprofit project. He knows I like nonprofit, but love to help, nonprofits in my area. And so he just was touching base. It was not a big deal, but it was a thoughtful thing that he did. And when it came up, and so I knew Mark. Mark is a CFO of mid-sized heavy industry companies, particularly in the family-owned or private space in Philadelphia. So when it came up that a company in New Jersey needed a person who was a CFO, who, all the things matched, I went, oh, I know Mark. Mark calls me all the time. So I put Mark in touch with that person. He got the board role and they were off to the races. But it's that kind of thing where I'm like, oh, he's easy to work with. Now, I know people who've also done some of that, who have been very demanding. Why aren't you calling me back constantly? It was, what was special with Mark is that he didn't require anything. He just was like, hey, here I am. How are you? Hope things are well. And that kind of thing, that sort of easy to work with, easy to understand, easy to communicate, shows me that you're going to be that kind of person likely on the board, that you'll be collegial and thoughtful and be able to dialogue with your fellow board members. And it makes me more inclined to want to help, to make my client happy, because the client is who pays when it comes to corporate recruiting or board recruiting. The client is who pays me. So I want to make them happy by finding the right candidate. And so Mark is a very successful role for Mark. And then the last thing on there is just get out there. You want to get out anywhere you can, talk to anyone you can, talk to family members, call former colleagues. Once you're ready for a board role, really make the effort to say yes to presentations. If people want you to come give a speech on the latest, HR regulations, say yes and get on that stage. And in your speech, say, oh, it's interesting. We were talking about regulation at this board program that we were at, and it lets people know in the room that you're ready for board work. When you show up, people are more likely to help you in the long run. So saying yes to things and getting out there and, as you can, as you have the ability, and don't say yes to things you can't do well, I always say, because your brand will precede you. But if you can, say yes, get out there and let people know that you're available. And lastly, be patient, persistent, and get support, whether it's me, whether it's Cindy, whether it's anyone else in your network. Get people to buy in and be your champion. And I'm going to stop and take questions.
Rochelle, again about LinkedIn. Does it matter whether your account is premium or vanilla?
No, I can find you anyway. It changes what you can do on it, but I can find you, and that's really the end goal.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
You guys, we got about 8 more minutes. Take advantage of this.
I ran through it today.
So Rochelle, from a strategy point of view, given the paucity of traditional board roles, does it make more sense from a strategy point of view to pursue startup roles?
I think startup roles are really good in that they can offer you, if it's your first board role for sure, they offer you the option to, what am I trying to say? It's good experience is what I'm trying to say. And that's what you want. You want good experience. You want to actually have the opportunity to make mistakes, ask questions, maybe get too far in the weeds, to get pulled out of the weeds by somebody else. And again, the reality is that it takes a board role to get a board role. and I should have maybe elaborated a little more on that, but what I did mean was some version of, if people see that you're already a board member, even so if all you have is nonprofit, but you have nonprofit, then move up, then go private, then go startup, then go VCPE. If you're part of a PE group, sit on a portfolio board and and try to make it as independent as you can. If you're on a nonprofit board, get to the money. So join the audit committee, join the treasury or the financing or fundraising or whatever that looks like for the nonprofit. But do that, because when you get to the money, you're more likely to be able to, there's more fiduciary structures involved on a nonprofit board where there's money. So it demonstrates that if you can say I was on, Kids R Us, local nonprofit, and I was on the audit committee there or the treasury committee there, then people say, oh, that really was a responsibility that took more than just, you giving them your name and walking away. And no, I'm sure you guys all know this, but just in case, nonprofits want one of three things. They want your time, your money, or your name. Figure out what it is that they want and make sure that you can give that in full transparency and confidence. I think I saw another question come in. Getting a warm introduction to search firms as much. Yes, that's absolutely true. And hi, Megan, nice to see you. On there, how do we pursue board roles with PE sector? Ooh, that is tough. So PE firms, how do we identify PE firms recruit outside? Okay. It's hard. It's very hard. That's one of the hardest things you can do. PE firms require you to be able to know them. It's very insular. We know that because as we think about money and financing in businesses, women only get 2% of all financing money because PE firms are insular and only pay, finance and pay and bring people in that they know. So that is to say that if you have any introduction into a PE firm, if the company you work with or anyone you know, or your grandma's giving to a PE, not that give to PE firms, but you know what I mean. If there's any way that you have an introduction and can get a warm introduction to a PE firm, reaching out, and everyone loves free advice. So reaching out, if you know that they've got, taken an interest in X company and you have insight into X company or X industry, you can just reach out and say, hey, I know X, Y, and Z thing. Happy to share it with you. And then start that relationship. And it really takes time to build trust. You have to build trust in a PE firm. I recruit into PE firms, but it's because I've built the relationships. So they trust me to bring them the people, and then they'll do their, a lot of vetting on their side to be able to trust them. And typically the way PE works is that when a PE firm takes an interest or a stake in a company, they usually will figure out, and it kind of depends on what style of PE firm it is, but they'll usually figure out who stays. Sometimes some PE firms, everyone stays, some don't. They bring in 1 or 2 or 3 operating executives of their own, and then they create independence for, typically if it's multiple, especially if it's multiple PE firms, they create 1 to 3 roles for independents to join those boards to help look over the investment for everyone. So an example of that would be, so I was working with a company, it was a pharmaceutical. And so what they did was bring in, they had 2 or 3 PE firms that did the original investment. They left most of the original team in place. They created a board between the PE firm and the original team, and then a couple of outsiders to both provide advice and value. It's really about advice and value. And then for all interests involved to have some oversight into the process and be able to provide some outside counsel. And a lot of what we're seeing, just the PE world is changing. It's not what it was in the 80s or 90s or even 2000s. So many companies, it used to be buy a company, split it up, or buy a company and flip it. The value in companies has changed so dramatically that PE firms are holding longer, and do for that reason tend to look a little more towards outside investors, or outside board members. So would be somewhere, it used to be 2-year holds and flip. Now we're looking at 3 and 5 and 7-year holds and flips. Let's see, another question. If their investment you get a certain number of board chairs. Depends on, Sloan, to your question about board chairs, it depends on what they're buying into and how much they bought into. And there's no rhyme or reason to, it's just whatever the contract happens to be made. But it is usually 1, 2, 3 seats, and the PE firm generally takes the lead in whatever that looks like. And usually the company they're buying either buying in whole or buying in part, has to just like it. I'm being a little flip, and I'm obviously painting with broad strokes here, but that's generally what happens. how is board exposure by being part of the C-suite? Good question about board exposure and the C-suite. So a quick note there is that it is, again, any board role is, any board work is helpful if there is none. So if you have none, again, get a nonprofit board at least. You can get one, there's an organization called NGO Jobs Board. There's an organization called Volunteer Match on LinkedIn. You can go onto LinkedIn, onto the jobs section, type in board director, don't type in, or board member, don't type in director because it confuses the search functionality. You're still going to get some not relevant stuff in there for executive directors of people who work or have responded to boards, but you will get board roles and you will get nonprofit board roles, and you can apply for board roles that way. Alternatively, you can, if you love something, if you have a passion, dogs, kids, houses, whatever the thing is that you love, bugs, go find a nonprofit that does that and just let them know that you're available for board work. Most nonprofits won't turn away a board member. So it's another way to figure out what your passion is, make sure that you're going to do it well, that you're going to value your time there, that you're going to put in the, work time, money, name, whatever it is they're looking for, and make sure you're doing it well. So back to not having any though, in lieu of having any, or even if you have some, in your executive roles, if you have interfaced with the board, it is helpful to mention in like a bullet that you worked with the board on board presentations, you interfaced. In some organizations, executives will run the committees, not often, but some. So if you've done that, then note that as well. And it's helpful to build the muscle, but even that is honestly not as likely or as helpful as a nonprofit board role to get you a board seat. It's like, oh, I can see that they do that, but really they want you to have sat in the room and had the negotiations and been part of the oversight team without the doing. And that's what they're afraid of. They're afraid you're going to come in and do rather than oversee. Any questions or comments? I know we're about at time.
Okay, so thanks everyone. Rochelle, thank you again. You're amazing. Everybody says you're awesome, you're amazing. So we really appreciate it. I will be sending out a follow-up email with the recording, with the slide that Rochelle used, and with copying Rochelle. So you can reply and you can actually ask her questions or set up a time to talk to her, okay? And then also you'll get a copy of our kind of board curriculum so you know what the ES board program is all about. And if you have any questions, let me know. And thanks for being here, everybody. Really appreciate it.
Susan, Cindy, I would just add that I offer complimentary, I do coaching and evaluations and all kinds of stuff, but I offer a complimentary 30-minute consultation. So if you have any questions, you can just connect with me. On my website, there's a contact us for a free, you can get on that page and find the complimentary link to sign up and get some time. So
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.